CRNA guy here. Just want to bring you another video. And again, if these videos are helpful, please like, subscribe, comment, click the little notification bell that lets you know when I put a new video out. And just, again, let me know that these videos are helpful, that they're actually teaching you something. So what I want to talk about today is something called a subdural epidural catheter. And what do I mean by a subdural epidural catheter? So the first thing to do to kind of orient your brain around what I'm talking about here is let's think about what are the tissues you go through as you insert an epidural needle. So obviously you go through the skin, you go through subcutaneous tissue, you go through the supraspinous ligament, the interspinous ligament, the ligamentum flavum. Then you enter the epidural space, which really again is, it's a potential space, right? It's not an actual space. The tissue layers are laying just right on top of one another, and by putting something into there, you create the space. But ligamentum flavum, epidural space, dura, and then what comes next after the dura? This is where it might get a little dicey, and I catch students up with this all the time when I ask. So dura, arachnoid, and then subarachnoid space. That's why it's called the subarachnoid space when we do a spinal. There is another layer there before you get into that space. Typically we don't really think of it because when we puncture the dura, we 99% of the time puncture the arachnoid at the same time. It's a simultaneous thing because the arachnoid mater is such a, kind of like thin and webby layer that you pretty much just puncture it at the same time. So usually we just talk about that pop that you feel with a spinal is puncturing the dura, but you're really puncturing the dura and the arachnoid mater. So when I say a subdural epidural catheter, what I mean is an epidural catheter that has somehow wedged its way in between the dura and the arachnoid. It's not a spinal, it's not an epidural. It's some kind of hybrid of the two. So I'll tell you what happened to me and how I learned about this myself. So I was doing an epidural with a student, and senior student, but they wet tapped the patient. Unfortunately, it happens, right? But student wet tapped the patient, so I took over. And I thought to myself, well, I'll go in at the same level. Instead of creating another poke hole in the back and more local and discomfort, I'll go in through the same space. I just won't wet tap the patient. I'll go through the same space, get into the epidural space, and we'll be good to go. So I did the epidural, got in just fine, nice loss of resistance, thread my catheter just fine. I don't remember if it was, a little bit difficult at all, but sometimes it is a little bit harder to put the catheter in. So thread my catheter in, pull my needle out, negative test dose, everything seems fine, tape everything up, lay the patient down. At this point, more worried about just whether she's going to get a headache or not, but give my first bit of my bolus dose. I believe I gave 5 cc's at the beginning. And a couple things started to happen. Number one, the onset of the block was very quick. It was abnormally fast. Now, you will see variation in how fast an epidural sets up. Sometimes it does work very quickly. Sometimes it takes a long time. I've had at least one time where I can think of where I had an epidural take so long to set up, like 30 minutes, that I started wondering if it was actually in because it was just taking so long to set up. And once I waited long enough, she started getting relief. I'm like, whew, thank goodness. Because the last thing you want to do is sit somebody right back up again and do another epidural. That would suck for everybody. So, but there's variation in how fast the epidural's set up. Now, in this girl's case, it set up very quickly. So I was kind of like, okay, that happens. But then she started to get a high block. She started to get tingling all the way up into her arms and her shoulders. And at that point, I was like, okay, time to put a pause on what I'm doing here. I'm not going to push any more drug until I stop and see what's happening. In addition, she started to show signs of a strong sympathetic blockade, hypotension. I don't believe she got bradycardic or anything, which that's another thing that we could probably talk about in the future. Why you would get bradycardic with hypotension. Hopefully you're learning this already, but that's something we could talk about. But she started getting hypotensive, high block, quick onset. So I said, time out. I called my staff guy and I explained everything pretty much like I just explained to you guys. And he said, you have probably a subdural catheter. And I said, a what? What do you mean a subdural catheter? And obviously went on to explain, and I ended up doing a bit of reading myself to try to figure out exactly what this meant. And we'll talk about it in a second. So what did I do? How do you deal with this? But so real quick, here's what I think happened. So the student wet taps the patient, puts a hole in the dura. I go in at the same level. I get my loss of resistance. I don't go too far. I don't wet tap the patient. But because of the angle of the tip of the needle, the epidural needle, because it directs the catheter upwards as it goes in, I think what happened is, so the needle was sitting in the space, in the epidural space, but the catheter, as it came out of the end of the needle, hooked into the little hole in the dura. And as I began to advance it, it advanced not all the way into the subarachnoid space, but just happened to get in between the dura and the arachnoid. Now, I don't know what the incidence of this is, being that I've only seen it once in 8 years, and I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of epidurals, and no one I really ever talked to has seen this before. I have a feeling that it's pretty darn rare. Again, I, for the most part, am not, I'm not, when I make these videos, I'm not going to all the textbooks and researching the living daylights. I'm just sharing my anecdotal evidence. I'm sharing just my experience. So I don't have the stats for you, but I have a feeling that it is pretty darn rare for this to happen, because it would have to be a specific set of circumstances for it to happen. But so that catheter, hooked into that little hole, and that's what I ended up with, this subdural epidural catheter. So what did we do? Which is what I started doing immediately, we stopped bolusing the catheter. This is an unpredictable catheter. This is not something that you just go to a textbook and you say, okay, now that I have this, how do I use a subdural catheter? What should I set the rate at on my drip? No. Stop bolusing. You're going to pull your epidural out. We waited until the epidural completely wore off, and then we offered her another epidural. It was unfortunate. I felt really bad, having to tell her all this and having to come back and do it again. But that's what we did. We just let it wear off. We came back later, and I did another epidural on her at a different level, right? I wasn't going to make that same mistake again. So that's something else that has changed in my practice now, where if somebody before me wet taps, or even if I wet tap a patient, I never go at the same level again. I always move up a level, because this is one of the potential things that could happen. One of the other potential things that could happen, actually, is if you happen to go through the same exact track and you push through that ligamentum flavum at the same spot, you may not get the same loss of resistance, and you may end up wet tapping the patient before you even realize that you're there. So always go to another level if somebody wet taps before you, or you wet tap the patient. So yeah, that is a subdural epidural catheter. Again, like, subscribe if this video helped you out at all. Let me know in the comments, have you ever heard of this before? Have you ever read about it? Has anyone else talked to you about it? let me know. I'd be interested to see if anyone else has ever had this experience. But again, like, subscribe, comment, click the notification button, and again, in the comments, let me know if there's any topics you want me to go over. Let me know if there's anything you want me to talk about, and I'll try to make a video about it. All right, thanks.